Hi, in this video we are going to be looking at homologous chromosomes and then what is the connections of those homologous chromosomes to Mendelian and non-Mendelian genetics, and finally how is DNA replication related, or how do we fit in the narrative of DNA replication into the chromosomes, because as you have noticed, these concepts are the concepts in grade 8 and also in grade 9, and the hope here is we want to get a connection between the topic of DNA replication in grade 10 to the previous topics, because after all, that's what science is. It's about the connection of concepts. So let me start with a human being. And again, the human being has, or every living thing has DNA, and this DNA is a long string of molecules that it's packaged in chromosomes, right? So think about thread. If you have thread, you don't just put them in the floor lying around. You kind of have to wrap it around a structure so that uh, it's not going to be a mess, and it will not be entangled with itself, right? So this DNA molecule is kind of divided into segments, into packages, and those packages are what we call chromosomes. And for a human being, you have 46 chromosomes, okay? But uh, these 46 chromosomes are actually 23 pairs, because 23 of those chromosomes come from your father and 23 come from your mother. So that's why it's 46, because 23 came from your father and 23 came from your mother. And there is a 1:1 relationship between them. So let's take, for example, chromosome number 1. So if you take chromosome number 1, there is a chromosome number 1 coming from your father. We label that 1F just for uh, easy recognition. And then another chromosome is chromosome number 1 also, but it is coming from your mother. Now, these chromosomes, and by the way, there are also chromosome number 2 from your father and from your mother, number 3 from your mother and from your father, all the way up to chromosome 23. And in fact, chromosome number 23 is the sex chromosome. It's the one that determines your gender, whether you are a male or a female. But more on that later. So the thing is, these chromosomes, this pair, is what we call a homologous chromosome pair. Homologous chromosome pairs. If you look at the word, homo means same. So they are kind of equivalent. Not really identical, but equivalent. Equivalent means this chromosome from your father is kind of the same as this chromosome from your mother. But think of it as they are, again, instructions for your body, but you have a different instruction coming from your father and you have different instructions coming from your mother. It's just that they code for the same thing. So for example, just an example, this is not realistic or anything, but just so that it's easy to understand, you can think of eye color. So for example, eye color, your iris might be blue, your iris might be black. If you're Filipino, it's usually black or brown. If you're kind of a European, it might be blue or green or something like that. So what if your father was American, and so he has green iris? So or pupil, yeah, iris. So the genes, and let's say that those genes are in chromosome 1. I don't actually know which chromosomes uh, that gene is, which chromosome that gene is, and I suspect that it's actually from multiple chromosomes. But again, just for simplicity, let's just assume that that instruction is in chromosome 1. Guess what? Your mother also has the same instructions, but because your mother is Filipino, her instructions would probably to make uh, black pigments for your eyes, right? So see, they are the same in the sense that they code for the proteins for the color of the eyes. This one also codes for the proteins for the color of your eyes. But this is kind of different because your father is American, so it kind of tells the cell to make blue pigments. But for your mother, your mother's Filipina, so it tells your cell to create black pigments, right? So that's the idea. So they are equivalent in the sense that they code for the same proteins for the same functions, but they are different in the sense that the instructions from your father is different from the instruction from your mother, but they are kind of the same. If this is a recipe book, this is a recipe for desserts. This is also a recipe for desserts. So in fact, if you look at page 20 to page 40, again, this is just an analogy. And if page 20 to page 20 is about making leche plan, and your mother's recipe book, page 20 to page 40, is still about making leche plan. It's just that the leche plan of your father is a little bit different. Maybe uses more eggs, and your mother's instructions uses more milk. But the point is, it still codes for the same thing, right? Again, that's an analogy, and it's kind of a stretched analogy, but again, it gives you this narrative that it's easy, so that it's easy to understand. Now, I want to connect this to your Mendelian genetics. So remember your Mendelian genetics. For example, if you have a gene or genotype that is this capital T and small t, that means this is for for a tall person, for a short person. And then you have your mother's gene is short and short, and then you do the Punnett square, right? You do this, and then you say, well, this offspring will be capital T, small t, this offspring will be capital T, small t, this offspring will be small t, and this offspring will be small t. And then usually we say that, well, out of the four possibilities, two of those offsprings will be tall, and two of them will be short. That's because we reason out that this capital T gene is kind of dominant. Dominant meaning it dominates over the other, and this short gene is recessive. So that means that if the cells encounter this, small t and capital T, the capital T would be followed and not the small t. Or at least it dominates over the small t. So instead of being short, you become tall. So if this is you, right? If you are this offspring, which has this genotype of capital T and small t, what happens is your cells would try to look for instructions to create your proteins. This tells you to be tall, this tells you to be short, but because this one is dominant, you will become tall. And again, how do you relate this to homologous pair? Well, that's exactly why you have two homologous pairs, because you have two alleles. And the point here is, just like the color of your eyes, your father instructs them to be green, but your mother's genes instructs them to be black. It's kind of like this. Your father's genes might instruct you to create proteins that would make your bones grow longer and you become taller, but your mother's genes might tell you to, not produce those, or produce other proteins that make you short. But the point is, it's like that. So you can think of the cells going to your chromosomes, looking at the instructions from your father, looking at the instructions from your mother, and the cells kind of follow the dominant type, or at least in the execution of it, it's the dominant type that kind of overpowers the recessive type. But that is the point. The cell kind of chooses the dominant type, so that's why you have this Mendelian genetics, where you would say that if you were this person, then you would be tall, but in your genes you have that short gene. It's just that it's your tall gene that kind of dominates over this gene. Unfortunately, if you were this offspring here, then you would become short, because unfortunately you have instructions that are from your father that tells you to be short, and from your mother that also tells you to be short. So the cells have no choice. You will become short. Okay. So, but let me clarify. This is just a tool for you to understand. But in reality, the instruction for making you tall probably is not found in just one chromosome. It's probably a combination of the effects of different proteins from different chromosomes. But again, this is just a tool so that you kind of understand why there's two copies, why there's recessive and there's just dominant. And if, in case you're wondering, why does your father have two pairs? Well, because this is from your grandfather's side, and this is from your grandmother. This gene here is coming from your grandfather on your mother's side, and this is coming from your grandmother from your mother's side, right? So even if your father is tall, but maybe he has a recessive gene from your grandmother that is short. That's why when your father and mother make offspring, there's still a chance for an offspring to be short. Okay, but I hope you get this idea of how do we relate this two different alleles or dominant and recessive types to the chromosomes, right? Because again, this is related to your homologous pair. Now, there are differences. Alleles are just traits, while chromosomes are, the instructions themselves for proteins, and those proteins might be related to a trait, or it might be a combination of proteins that is related to a trait. But the point is, it's kind of, that's how you kind of extend and how you connect the Punnett square or Mendelian genetics, recessive and dominant type, to the homologous pair. Now, remember that in grade 9, you also kind of discuss non-Mendelian genetics. And non-Mendelian genetics is a case where there's no allele dominates. So, for example, if your parent, if maybe let's talk about a flower. If the flower produces red petals, and then the other parent is white petals, sometimes if this was dominant or recessive, it would be red or white depending on which is dominant. But if you have non-Mendelian inheritance, sometimes these two actually combine, and instead of producing red petals or white petals, you produce pink petals. And that's because you can think of it as maybe red is dominant, so there's a lot of red, but it's mixed in with a little white. That's why it became pink, because if you think about it, red and then you mix it with some white, it becomes pink. So in this case, you kind of think of maybe this is dominant, but it doesn't really completely dominate. So this is what we call incomplete dominance. It's different from the previous discussion, because in the previous one, the cell would know which one is dominant and which one is recessive, and dominant will always dominate over the recessive one. This one is it's kind of both are expressed, but one's dominating, but it doesn't completely drown out the other. So that's why instead of completely red or completely white, you get pink, which is sort of a combination of the red and white. A lot of red, but a little bit of white. So that's what we call incomplete dominance, right? So I hope this rings a bell in your head, because again, it's important that you see these connections to our main topic, which is DNA replication. Now, aside from incomplete dominance, you can also have things like codominance, right? So from the word itself, codominance, it's like it suggests that they dominate, both of them, because the co meaning they are kind of equal, right? So codominance is a case where, for example, you have a dog, and the father's fur is black and the mother's fur is gray, is white. Remember, if this is incomplete dominance, then it would be a lot of black but a little bit of white, so you end up with gray. Right? That's incomplete dominance. Codominance is really different. Codominance means both of them dominate, but at different parts. What do you mean by different parts? Meaning, if this is the dog, maybe at this patch of its skin, it's the black one that dominates. But maybe at this patch, it's the white one that dominates. At this patch, it's the black that dominates. At this patch, it's the white that dominates. So you would have a dog where its fur is kind of in patches, where this is a black patch, this is a white patch, this is a white patch, this is a black patch. So that is how you get things like Dalmatians and other stuff. So that's codominance, meaning there is black dominating, there is white dominating, but at certain parts. At this part, it's the black that dominates, but at this part, it's the white that dominates. Remember, it's different from incomplete dominance, because incomplete dominance, this is expressed and that is expressed, and they're kind of mixed. So instead of black and white, you get gray. But in this case, you really get black, but only at these points. You get white, but only at this point. So that's what we call codominance. So again, how do you kind of relate this to homologous pairs? That's again those alleles that we've been talking about, like red flower, red pigments for the petals, or white pigments for the petals, or black fur and white fur. Why are there two sets of instructions? That's because one is instruction coming from your father, one instruction coming from your mother. But again, it's equivalent in the sense that they tell the color of the fur. This one tells also the color of the fur. It's just that father's instruction is different from mother's instruction. And again, sometimes one of those instructions is dominant and one is recessive, so we get Mendelian genetics, where there's dominant and there's recessive, and you can apply things like Punnett square. But sometimes these things would be non-Mendelian inheritance, so that would be things like codominance and incomplete dominance, and other things like blood type, like sex linked traits, and those things. But that is the point. Okay, so now Now that we got that out of the way, we now kind of know how these chromosomes are kind of related to the Mendelian and non-Mendelian genetics that we discussed in grade 8 and grade 9. Now, let's look at how this is replicated, because after all, our main topic is DNA replication. So what happens is, again, there are 23 pairs, but again, just for so that it becomes easier, let's just draw one pair, which is chromosome number 1. So let's just assume an organism that only has one chromosome, right? I could draw 23, but again, that would take a lot of time. So what happens is, when this gets duplicated, when the cell, then the DNA, remember the DNA is this chromosome. DNA is just packaged. Chromosome is just a packaging of DNA and histones. What happens is, because this is replicated, guess what? Father's chromosome, which is chromosome 1 from your father, 1F, would develop a sister chromatid. Okay? And the same thing, mother's chromosome, which was one structure, develops a sister chromatid. Right? And this is still chromosome 1 from father. This is still chromosome 1 from mother. But as you notice, you now have two chromatids. Right? So what does it mean by a chromatids? What does it mean to say that it has two sister chromatids, sir? That means this one is now replicated into two. So instead of only one, you now have two structures, and these structures are called chromatids, meaning this second one is an exact copy of that one because of DNA replication. And this is also an exact copy of that one, right? And obviously, if we continue this, that means in the next phase, they would kind of align at the center. Remember, they will kind of, sorry, should be using red. They would kind of align at the center. Remember, and then remember the cell kind of divides and kind of pulls apart the sister chromatids. So this one goes into this cell, well, the other one goes into that cell, and this blue one goes in there, and this red one goes in there, and then this blue one here goes in this cell, and then this red one goes in this cell. So notice that you have two daughter cells, right? And you started with a homologous pair, which is one from your father, one from your mother, but it's just a pair. What do you end up with? You end up with also a cell with a pair, a cell with a pair. In fact, a cell with chromosome 1 from father, chromosome 1 from father, and chromosome 1 from mother, chromosome 1 from mother. So this means that these two are an exact copy of that one. So this is what we call mitosis. And again, I just want to dispel some common misconception. The common misconception is number one, students think that these are sister chromatids. No, they are homologous chromosomes. This is really a chromosome from your father, a chromosome from your mother. So they are not sisters. They are not copies of each other. However, those homologous chromosomes will be duplicated such that this develops a sister chromatid, and this is exactly like that, and this is also like that. So be aware, these are the sister chromatids. These are not sister chromatids. These are just equivalent chromosomes we call homologous chromosome. One from your father, one from your mother. So that's kind of how. So how does the DNA replication fit in here? This part. When DNA gets replicated, this single structure chromosome from father develops a second structure, which is a sister chromatid, and this is just an exact copy of that. And the same thing for mother's chromosome. Okay, so I guess that would be all for this video. I will just add some concepts in the next video because this is getting too long.